Isaiah chapter 31, beginning in verse 1. It says, "Woe to them that go down to Egypt for help, and stay on horses and trust in chariots, because they are many, and in horsemen, because they are very strong. But they look not unto the Holy One of Israel, neither seek the Lord. Yet he also is wise, and will bring evil, and will not call back his words, but will arise against the house of the evildoers, and against the help of them that work iniquity. Now the Egyptians are men, and not God, and their horses flesh, and not spirit. When the Lord shall stretch out his hand, both he that helpeth shall fall, and he that is holpen shall fall down, and they all shall fail together. For thus hath the Lord spoken unto me, like as the lion and the young lion roaring on his prey, when a multitude of shepherds is called forth against him, he will not be afraid of their voice, nor abase himself for the noise of them. So shall the Lord of hosts come down to fight for Mount Zion, and for the hill thereof. As birds flying, so will the Lord of hosts defend Jerusalem. Defending also he will deliver it, and passing over he will preserve it. Turn ye unto him from whom the children of Israel have deeply revolted. For in that day every man shall cast away his idols of silver, and his idols of gold, which your own hands have made unto you for a sin. Then shall the Assyrian fall with the sword, not of a mighty man, and the sword not of a mean man, and shall devour him, but he shall flee from the sword, and his young men shall be discomfited. And he shall pass over to his stronghold for fear, and his princes shall be afraid of the ensign, saith the Lord, whose fire is in Zion, and his furnace in Jerusalem." So, going back to verse 1, this is kind of a continuation of what we talked about last week in chapter 30, where the people of Judah and Jerusalem were warned by Isaiah. They were strongly cautioned against seeking help from Egypt, because Egypt, there is no help in them. And then we get some more detail, and it says that they should not seek help from Egypt, but they should rest in God. And then God makes a promise, and he says, I will do these things. He will protect them. So before we start going through here in verses 1 through 9, verse by verse, I want to go back and touch on a few things in the book of 2 Kings, and we'll be in chapters 17 and 18, but on your way there, if you want to stop by and look at the very beginning of the book of Isaiah, chapter 1 and verse 1. Isaiah chapter 1 verse 1 says, "The vision of Isaiah the son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah." And so you can see Ahaz and Hezekiah are both kings during the time that Isaiah is prophesying, and we're going to discuss a little bit of Ahaz and Hezekiah this morning before we start going through there verse by verse. One more thing I want to touch on. We did see in chapter 30, and we can look in Isaiah chapter 30 verses 1 and 2. It says, "Woe to the rebellious children, saith the Lord, that take counsel, but not of me, and that cover with a covering, but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, that walk to go down into Egypt, and have not asked at my mouth, to strengthen themselves in the strength of Pharaoh, and to trust in the shadow of Egypt." We can see here from chapter 30 that Judah, they have made some kind of alliance, they have made some kind of agreement, they've established some kind of relationship with Egypt. God is saying that they've already done it. So we'll look at and get some history now. With all that in mind, the first place that we're going to go to is 2 Kings chapter 17, and we're going to read verses 1 through 4. 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 through 4. It says, "In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, began Hoshea the son of Elah to reign in Samaria over Israel 9 years. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, but not as the kings of Israel that were before him. Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his servant and gave him presents. And the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and brought no present to the king of Assyria. as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. And so we see what happens here, and this is what leads to the destruction of the northern tribes. They're supposed to be paying tribute. Hoshea, he gets this idea that he's going to team up with Egypt. Well, okay, Pharaoh, let's just not pay the tribute. Let's rebel. And let's go it alone, and we'll work together to fight off these Assyrian people, these overlords that are stepping out of their bounds. Well, you see how it worked out for Hoshea in verse 4. When the king of Assyria found conspiracy, it says, he sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and sent messengers, and it says he brought no present. The king of Assyria just put him in prison. It wasn't even that difficult. There's no mention of a lot of struggle here. It just happened. And the rest of chapter 17 goes on to tell the very sad and pitiful outcome for the nation of Israel. How they were conquered and absorbed, how Samaria was absorbed, and you see the beginning of the people that are called Samaritans in the New Testament, people who are mixed with Gentile nations. They're sort of half Jewish and half Gentile, because the Assyrians, I've mentioned this time and time again, when they conquered a nation, they would take some of the people out and move them somewhere else. And then they would take people from elsewhere in their empire and move them in, and they would try to integrate everyone all together, so that way everyone would be loyal to Assyria and not loyal to their own original nation, loyal to their own original culture, to their own original religion. And that's what they did. And chapter 17 goes on to tell the rest of that. So the people of Jerusalem and Judah should have already had an example. Keep this in mind. They should have already had an example of Egypt not fulfilling its promises, of Egypt not being any help to anybody. Okay? We're going to step back and look at 2 Kings chapter 16, and we'll first look at verses 1 through 4. 2 Kings chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. How did they get into the mess with Assyria to begin with? We've talked about how Assyria, they're a very warlike empire. Every year they go out and conquer somebody else. It's their job. That's what they believe. They believe they have a heavenly mandate from their gods that they are supposed to go out and conquer. They are supposed to go out and destroy. They are supposed to go out and pillage. They're supposed to make themselves have dominion over the rest of the earth. That's what they believe. So looking here, but there's a reason why they specifically targeted Judah. So in chapter 16, verses 1 through 4, it says, in the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, Ahaz, the son of Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign. So here we see the beginning of Ahaz's reign. 20 years old was Ahaz when he began to reign, and reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and did not that which was right in the sight of the Lord his God, like David his father, but he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. Yea, and made his son to pass through the fire, according to the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord cast out from before the children of Israel. You remember last week when we read, when we saw at the end of chapter 30, we saw Tophet. And we went into the history of what Tophet was. It was the place in Gehenna, the valley of Hinnom, that place that serves as a picture in the Old Testament of what hell would be. It's not a full representation that's truly and 100% faithful to exactly what hell is. One, because it's on earth, in a physical place where people can just look at and there's daylight. Two, because it's not eternal. That place is not eternal. But it is a picture, it's a type of hell. We see that one of the reasons I believe that was mentioned was because the king before Hezekiah, and I should make clear that when Isaiah was prophesying in Isaiah chapter 30, that was during the reign of Hezekiah. Well, the king right before Hezekiah, he put his own son. We talked about how people would take their firstborn son, and they would take them and they would make them pass through the fire. They would offer them up as infants to this false god, Molech. He did that. It says in verse 3, and made his son to pass through the fire according to the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord cast out from before the children of Israel. And not only did he do that, and he sacrificed and burnt incense in the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. So here you have a very wicked king, and we've seen that established. Now, what does this wicked king do that would possibly get Assyria to set its sights on him? It says, at that time, in verse 6, or we'll just move on to verse 5. Then Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to war, and they besieged Ahaz, but could not overcome him. At that time, Rezin, king of Syria, recovered Elath to Syria, and drave the Jews from Elath, and the Syrians came to Elath and dwelt there unto this day. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am thy servant and thy son. I'm going to read that one more time so it sinks in. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am thy servant and thy son. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Syria and out of the hand of the king of Israel, which rise up against me. Now what does he do? And Ahaz took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house, and sent it for a present to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria hearkened unto him, for the king of Assyria went up against Damascus, and took it, and carried the people of it captive to Kir, and slew Rezin. Ahaz made a dirty deal with a worldly king. He did not trust in God, he trusted in this worldly king. And this worldly king did conquer. He made good on his deal. But guess what he found out? Guess what he learned whenever this deal was made? He learned of all kinds of riches in Judah. He learned of all kinds of things that would exist that he could take, things that would benefit his own empire. The Assyrians knew that Judah had wealth and that they could take it. So, understand that. There is a very good, perfect reason why Assyria would have its sights set. Now, we know God had planned to punish and judge Judah. He had planned to punish and judge Israel. And he allowed these things to work out. He allowed all these things to happen to accomplish his will so that these nations would be judged. And so this is how Assyria had its sights set. And the whole point that I wanted to make regarding this is that, Judah has got itself in a bind. And they have a history of, rather than trusting in God, trusting in other nations, trusting in other peoples, trusting in the world. They have a history of the previous king. Now, I want to take a look very quickly at 2 Kings chapter 18. And we'll just read the first few verses here, verses 1 through 5. 2 Kings 18, 1 through 5. It says, Now it came to pass in the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. So Ahaz reigned about 15 years, because it was in his 12th year that Hoshea began to reign. So here, this is not too long after. It says, 20 and 5 years old was he when he began to reign, and he reigned 20 and 9 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name also was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that David his father did. He removed the high places, and brake the images, and cut down the groves, and brake in pieces the brazen serpent that Moses had made. For unto those days the children of Israel did burn incense unto it, and he called it Nehushtan. He trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that after him was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor any that were before him. So you see the big shift in the difference between Ahaz and Hezekiah, and their willingness to serve the Lord, and their willingness to turn the nation to God and lead the nation toward God and try to rule over it in a godly manner. It's a very big difference. So when you see Israel being destroyed, remember Israel was destroyed earlier because they never had any good kings. You go from the first king to the last king in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, and you can read all about them again in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. You get 2 accounts. They had no good kings. Judah had a few. One of them was Hezekiah, and I believe it's because they had those few good kings, specifically, most likely, in this instance, Hezekiah, that they were spared and allowed to go further, that God was willing to show mercy and grace toward them because of their willingness to repent. So, we see here that Hezekiah was willing to trust God. And so when Isaiah prophesies, he's saying, don't trust Egypt. Trust God. Don't go into Egypt. Don't further sully ourselves with the Egyptians. Trust God. We saw that in chapter 30, and here we see that again in chapter 31, verse 1. We will be going back to 2 Kings chapter 18 in just a minute, but I'm going to read here the first verse of chapter 31 again in Isaiah. It says, "Woe to them that go down to Egypt for help, and stay on horses and trust in chariots, because they are many, and in horsemen, because they are very strong. But they look not unto the Holy One of Israel, neither seek the Lord." This is a message that would reach Hezekiah. Hezekiah is a man who was willing to trust God. He's a man who, it says more than any other king of Judah before him or after him, was willing to place his faith in God. You think a message like that isn't going to reach him and get to him? It will. And we'll see that when we get here just a few more chapters later on in the book of Isaiah, but it will reach him. And I believe it did, and I don't think it took very long either. But I want you to see something, and we're going to get just a little bit ahead of ourselves in the story. We're going to jump forward in time just a little bit. But I want to look at 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 17 through 21, just to drive home the fact that Egypt is absolutely useless for the people of Judah. Not only is God saying it, but I want you to see here in 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 17 through 21, what's said here. And this should be somewhat familiar because we've talked about this scripture before. So 2 Kings chapter 18, in verse 17, it says, "And the king of Assyria sent Tartan and Rabsaris and Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah with a great host against Jerusalem. And they went up and came to Jerusalem. And when they were come up, they came and stood by the conduit of the upper pool, which is in the highway of the fuller's field. And when they had called to the king, there came out to them Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, which was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and Joah, the son of Asaph, the recorder." And so these great big people from Assyria came. And I remember reading this when we talked about who this Tartan is. Again, Tartan isn't a name for a person. It's a title in Assyria that's given to the second in command. He's basically the high commander of the army. The only person who has any more control over the army than this person is the king himself. But this guy pretty much has the authority to, he makes the plans, he does what he says goes. He's the one in the field, he's the one commanding. The king would be back on the throne. The king wouldn't be able to just issue orders and have them followed and carried down the chain of command immediately. It's not like today where you can sit 3,000 miles, 6,000 miles, 9,000, 12,000, 15,000 miles away from somewhere and issue a command and it be immediately executed. So he had this person as his field commander. Maybe the title that you might think of if you compare it to like European forces might be a field marshal, the highest person in command over the forces. So it says here that this person and Rabsaris and Rabshakeh were sent to Hezekiah. And these people came out to meet him, Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah. It says in verse 19, "And Rabshakeh said unto them, Speak ye now to Hezekiah. Thus saith the great king, the king of Assyria, What confidence is this wherein thou trustest?" And this is important because they're coming down because Hezekiah has already rebelled against Assyria. Hezekiah has decided he will not bow down to Assyria. He will not follow their commands. He will not submit himself to them. He will follow God. That's his idea. He will lead the people of Judah as an independent people, as God's chosen people. He says in verse 20, Thou sayest, but they are but vain words. I have counsel and strength for the war. And so Hezekiah has told this king. He sent emissaries, he sent people, he sent this message. I'm strong enough to take you on. This is the message that's been received by Assyria. And the Assyrians are claiming, oh, that's just vanity. You don't have anything that could possibly stand against us. He says, Now on whom dost thou trust that thou rebellest against me? Now behold, thou trustest upon the staff of this bruised reed, even upon Egypt, on which if a man lean, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, unto all that trust on him. And he's making a play on the Egyptian people, because in Egypt, along the Nile, of course, these great reeds grow all along the Nile River. But what happens if you try to put your body weight on one of those? What happens is it snaps, and if you try to hold your hand on it and lean on it, it'll snap and it'll splinter, and it'll pierce your hand. Those splinters will get in your hand. He's saying, from what I understand, he's kind of making a play on the reeds that grow by the Nile, which is in Egypt, and he's saying, that's all that Egypt is. You try to lean on them, you're just going to get hurt. Don't even waste your time. That's what the world thinks of Egypt, let alone what God thinks. That's what the enemy thinks. And let me tell you, the enemy's right. Egypt would have been no help here. So, that, I hope everyone understands, Egypt was no help. You see in verse 2, back in Isaiah chapter 31, and we'll move forward here and we'll try to get through the rest of the chapter quickly. It says, Yet he also is wise and will bring evil, and will not call back his words, but will arise against the house of the evildoers, and against the help of them that work iniquity. God says, if you try to lean on Egypt, I will rise up against that. God says, you will make me an enemy if you lean on Egypt for this. If you make them your ally and trust wholly in them, you're not trusting in me, and I will be your enemy. He says in verse 3, Now the Egyptians are men and not God, and their horses flesh and not spirit. When the Lord shall stretch out his hand, both he that helpeth shall fall, and he that is holpen shall fall down, and they all shall fail together. I think that's very clear and very plain. I don't think I need to explain that one bit. God's laying it out on the line there. It says in verse 4, For thus hath the Lord spoken unto me, like as the lion and the young lion roaring on his prey when a multitude of shepherds is called forth against him. He will not be afraid of their voice, nor abase himself for the noise of them. So shall the Lord of hosts come down to fight for Mount Zion and for the hill thereof. I want you to see that. You can imagine at this time in history, you have a bunch of shepherds out in the field. What happens if a lion comes up? What happens if a lion comes up on your sheep? And the lion's going to kill the sheep. And if you try to stand between the lion and the sheep, the lion's going to kill you. God says, I'm like that lion. And the Assyrians are like the shepherds. Now you think about that. These great warlike people, God says, these are nothing but mere shepherds to me. And I'm like a lion. And I will take them out. It says, So shall the Lord of hosts come down to fight for Mount Zion and for the hill thereof. And so this, I believe, is locally fulfilled. And we'll see that in a few chapters. I don't want to talk about it and go through it too many times for sake of time. But God, as we've said, he will defend Jerusalem. We know how he did it. He sent his angel down whenever the Assyrians were camped about, and the angel killed 185,000 people in the span of one night. There's nobody that stands in God's way. It was locally fulfilled then, but I also believe that you can apply this, whether it's doctrinally related, whether it's actually doctrinally a dual prophecy, or whether you can just go ahead and spiritually apply the dual application of the prophecy, in that this is how strong God is. How strong do you think when he's going to be when he comes back in person at the time of the end of the tribulation to take back his kingdom and to put down his enemies? He will not abase himself for the noise of them. And that to me, when Jesus comes back, he's not going to stand out of the way for anybody. He's not going to stop for anybody. When he begins his march will continue until he's finished, until he's completed the mission, until he has set up his kingdom. And that's what he's going to do. So it says in verse 5 now, "As birds flying, so will the Lord of hosts defend Jerusalem. Defending also, he will deliver it, and passing over, he will preserve it. Turn ye unto him, from whom the children of Israel have deeply revolted. For in that day every man shall cast away his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which your own hands have made for you unto you for a sin." You see, for in that day every man shall cast away his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which your own hands have made unto you for a sin. It says, "Then shall the Assyrian fall with the sword, not of a mighty man, and the sword, not of a mean man, shall devour him, but he shall flee from the sword, and his young men shall be discomfited." The Assyrian shall fall with the sword, and it's not the sword of a mighty man. It's not the sword of a mean man. It's the sword of God that drives away the Assyrian. And it says, "He shall flee from the sword, and his young men shall be discomfited." It says, "And he shall pass over to his stronghold for fear." And can you believe, for somebody like Ahaz, this would just be a bunch of hogwash. For somebody like Ahaz, I want you to think about this. Ahaz, if he were king at this point, when Isaiah is making this prophecy, Isaiah is telling him to trust in the Lord, and he's giving him this emphatic word from God that he's received. And he's saying, do not trust in Egypt. They're not going to be good for us. You've got to trust in God. God says he will protect us. God says that nothing will stand in his way. God says that he is the one who's most powerful. He is almighty. He is the Lord of hosts. He is the one in control. Ahaz would say, I don't know about that. I think we ought to try to I think we ought to play it safe and maximize our chances of success, and we ought to play the hand that we're dealt and make the best of it. When life gives you lemons, make lemonade. That's what we ought to do. But Hezekiah, can you imagine what he would have thought? Hezekiah, a man who trusts God more than any other king of Judah before him. That includes Solomon, by the way. Trusts God more than any other king before him and more than any other king of Judah after him. He hears these words, "And he shall pass over to his stronghold for fear," talking about the Assyrians. "And his princes shall be afraid of the ensign, saith the Lord, whose fire is in Zion and his furnace in Jerusalem." What words of encouragement, what words of strength and power must these words have been for Hezekiah? This man who is willing to trust God, this man who's willing to put his faith in God. We'll see how that all worked out when we get just a few chapters from where we're at. We have just a few more chapters of prophecy, and then we'll get into what's called an interlude. It's a historical interlude in the book of Isaiah where it goes from prophecy just to telling of history. And when we get to that history part, we'll see what this did. But it's very encouraging, and it should be very encouraging for us as Christians, because this is the same God we serve. That's the same Savior that we have. And that's how his enemies will all end up. Even though the world right now is the way that it is, even though Satan does have dominion over the earth currently, He's not in 100% control. He's a created being. He cannot compete with God. He cannot win against God. He can only flap around like a fish out of water until it's time for him to be punished for eternity. And I don't want to make too much light of Satan, because he is who he is. He is as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, and he's looking for Christians. So we don't want to get carried away and make too much light and think, oh well, he's nothing. He's an enemy, and he's a real enemy for us. But for God, he's nothing. So that is Isaiah chapter 31. We've got a few minutes. Does anyone have any questions or comments or anything else they want to know about this chapter?